This is a podcast for Kel. By the end of the first day of the inquest, we'd learned that the cable ties which the hospital had placed around Kelly's wiring could be undone without much fuss, and so Kelly had easy access to a means of killing herself. We'd also learned that at the hospital during Kel's stay, there had been markedly different accounts of Kel's behaviour. On the one hand, the nursing staff, who were seeing her every day, expressed several concerns about her lack of engagement. She was withdrawn, moody, she isolated herself, and that worried them. On the other hand, there was her consultant, who was seeing her every few days, and he wasn't concerned. With him, Kelly was engaged and showing signs of improvement. We'd also learned that this consultant had suspended hourly overnight observations for Kel, thus allowing Kel to be alone in her room between the hours of 10 o'clock at night and 7 in the morning. This went against the standard hospital policy. But this dynamic of getting professionals to bend the rules for her was also echoed in Kel's relationship with her therapist, who'd been prescribing extra medication for her on the side in doses that would fit in with her lifestyle. But a much more worrying discrepancy had come out in the evidence. Because despite Kelly reporting suicidal feelings to me and several others at the time she went into hospital, she didn't tell anybody treating her. She never reveals to anyone on the staff, whether it's consultant or admitting nurse, that she's been feeling suicidal. In fact, she denies it. This did my head in, because why did she put herself in the hospital's care and not tell them why she'd gone in? From what I understood, she'd gone in because she felt suicidal, and the ease with which these suicidal thoughts came to her was frightening. I was haunted by that question, because if she's not telling the hospital the real reason she's there, did that mean that in fact she had been planning it all along and she was just looking for an opportunity, biding her time? Just like Kelly's friend Eddie said when he described her as cunning.
When you want to hurt yourself, the psychiatrists, the nurses are not to trust you. And I think they trust her because she's friendly, she has an innocence to her.
She had a cut-through intelligence. She had
cunning.
Competence
it may sound harsh,
and practical.
It may sound harsh because she was already set on her goal.
Was that why she'd requested no overnight observations? So she could have a chance to kill herself when she wanted? I didn't want that to be true. I wanted to believe that she had really been trying and that she just was overtaken by something at the end that she couldn't control. But what does it matter what I wanted the facts to be? That was why we were at the inquest. I mean, so much worrying information and evidence had been produced for this inquest that you just steel yourself and go, well, okay, whatever it is. That was why we were there, to find out about things that we hadn't known at the time of Kelly's death. So that's what this episode is about. It's an attempt to get as close as possible to what actually was going on for Kel in her very last days. A lot of the things that we talk about in this part, we already talked about in part 10. But here, because of all the extra evidence and testimony that came in after she died, it's possible to build up a much more accurate picture of what was happening. So Kelly has gone into hospital on the 11th of March and she dies on the 7th of April. So that's nearly 4 weeks. And for the first 2 weeks, her recovery has been quite steady up until around the 25th of March. Everyone who's in contact with her, friends, family, and indeed the therapist and the consultant, they're pretty consistent in their observations about her progress. She seems to be recovering. But now we come to this last fortnight, and this is where things start to change. From Sunday, March the 25th, she starts complaining of food poisoning after she's gone for a meal with Ollie. And she develops gastroenteritis. And so she's in hospital for that week. But then on the 29th of March, she stops taking all of her medication. Now, that's not authorized by the doctors. And then she leaves the hospital and she becomes more ill. And on that night, she ends up spending the night at home because the gastroenteritis is so bad. So she's in touch with the hospital from home that night. But then, from then on, from the 30th of March up until the evening of the 4th of April, she's unaccounted for. She's not at the hospital, she's away. And this really was the focus of the second day of the inquest. Something must have happened to her, because on Wednesday, April the 4th, which is the day she ends up going back to hospital, that's the day when I'm called by James II in the afternoon, and he tells me that Kelly has threatened suicide by cyanide. And then I make several attempts to contact the hospital to alert them. Inexplicably, nobody picks up the phone. That also was a big question for the second day of the inquest, because if the hospital had been aware on Wednesday, April the 4th, of suicidal threats, it might have changed their approach with her over her last few days, because this is just 2.5 days before Kelly dies that this happens. So as we came into this second day of the inquest, this 5-day missing period hung over the proceedings. And it was said by one of the lawyers that if we knew what had been going on for Kel during that gap, we might have a clearer idea of her state of mind. The 5-day period is also one where I hadn't had much contact with Kel. I'd spoken to her on Thursday the 29th, but apart from that, she texted me on Sunday, April the 1st, apologising for missing my birthday. But apart from that, nothing until Wednesday the 4th of April. So let's look at what we know. On Friday the 30th of March, she's at home. She's meant to meet up with Ollie that day to talk about her work plans. Ollie and Kel had previously met 5 days earlier on the 25th of March. That was the day that she'd come away complaining of food poisoning.
So she told me she had gastroenteritis. It appears to be viral, and so it should be over by the end of the week. Haven't been able to eat because it results in me vomiting or shitting up a storm. So yeah, it looks like we were going to meet up on the 30th of March, but that was cancelled because she was ill.
It's from this point that Kel seems to go incommunicado. This is a long period for the hospital, who are trying to track her down. When they finally send her an email threatening to contact her next of kin, who she's listed as James II, Kelly responds, saying that she's at home and she feels better there. In a phone call with the hospital on Tuesday, April the 3rd, Kel says she's worried to come back. She fears that because she hasn't been engaging with treatment, they won't let her leave again. She's reassured by the nurse on the phone that this can't happen because she's there on a voluntary basis and they have no powers to detain her. It must be said that throughout the notes, they always assess Kel as being of good mental capacity. She's always aware of what's going on around her and is able to make decisions for herself. But this fear of Kel's that they might detain her is reflected in a paranoid text comment to me on Wednesday, April 4th. This is after I'd contacted her after James II had contacted me to tell me about her suicide threat. As part of a long rant against James, Kel says that James is trying to get her sanctioned, which I don't believe. I think she's all over the place. So on Wednesday, April the 4th, Kelly's making threats of suicide on the one hand and telling me that she's just trying to wind James up, going to the gym and acting completely normal. She then returns to hospital that evening, and the notes say that she's in subdued but stable mood. In her daily risk assessment, she self-assesses as no risk in all the areas on the form. This includes suicide and self-harm. "I'm feeling okay," her own words. She signs her consent to the medical plan on her risk assessment, but compared to previous entries, her signature's scrawly and unconfident. The next day, Thursday, April the 5th, she doesn't engage with staff, she doesn't attend her group therapy, and she refuses medication. Her regular consultant is away for a few days, so she's seen instead by a relief consultant who writes, "It was difficult to establish a rapport with her. Her speech was spontaneous and coherent. She denied the presence of biological symptoms of depression, and no psychotic symptoms were evident. She also denied the presence of suicidal ideation." Kelly says that she doesn't think she's benefiting from the inpatient programs and doesn't see the value of staying on in hospital. But the consultant doesn't want to release her whilst Dr. Bider is away. But he has no power to stop her because she's competent and she's not displaying overt symptoms. Kelly and her doctor agree that she'll hang on for a couple of days, but if she's certain about this, she could discharge herself on Sunday the 8th or Monday the 9th of April. They agree to meet again during the day on Saturday, April the 7th. As we know, that meeting never happened. On her daily risk assessment that day, she's described as subdued in mood, and her answers to nursing staff are monosyllabic. She self-assesses again as presenting no risk of suicide or self-harm. She signs her consent to the medical plan, but her handwriting, again, seems scrawly. Friday, April the 6th, is Kelly's last day alive. She refuses all interactions with staff, leaving them unable to make a risk assessment. The note on her file says that she's not presenting as at immediate risk of harm. Whereas on every other day, in response to the question, do you consent to your current treatment plan, she's ticked yes. Today, she ticks no. And for the first time, she refuses to sign her name to the form. It's 8 o'clock at night. In under 12 hours, she'll be found dead in her room. With her regular consultant away for the week, and nobody on the nursing staff being able to get close enough to her to make a risk assessment, no one treating her in those last few days had any significant knowledge or experience of her. On top of that, there'd been a catastrophic breakdown in communication on the afternoon of April the 4th. If the hospital had answered any one of my 7 calls that afternoon, they would have known that Kel had threatened suicide that day. Armed with that information, what assessment might her relief consultant have made on Thursday, April the 5th, when he consented to continue with the current treatment plan established by BIDA, i.e. no hourly overnight observations? This consultant, the relief psychiatrist, he wasn't embedded in a nuanced, delicate relationship with Kel like her main consultant was. And even though in the relief consultant's report he goes along with what Kel's asking for, he has to. She's a voluntary patient. She's competent. In the few minutes that he spends with her, he certainly makes the boldest, most negative assessment of Kel's mental health than was made by any staff member or doctor that she'd met in her last year. He says, overall, my opinion was that she was acutely unwell psychiatrically. And perhaps based on the fact that she's fucked off for 5 days and nobody can get a read on her for the past 2, wouldn't you then consider putting her back on observations? That's the question. I mean, I understand why they didn't. I get why they didn't. It's not as if the hospital had particularly concerning new information about the patient, is it? Which, of course, they would have had if they'd answered any one of my 7 calls on the afternoon of Wednesday, April the 4th. How might that have affected things? Zev, Kelly's friend since she was 14, disagrees with this way of looking at it.
An hourly kind of just like check, you can do it in the other 59 minutes. Yeah, I feel that more surveillance is not the answer, and because like this is kind of just like micro kind of just like details of just like, oh, if this had happened or if this had happened, would you still be here? But what if zoomed out a bit, just like what would have been like if the kind of just like if the hospital was a therapeutic environment for her? I mean, which is like what I'm talking about, it being kind of more like systematic rather than, so I don't necessarily think, oh, it's this doctor's fault for not doing this, or kind of like this nurse's fault for kind of just like not being able to like understand what was going on.
Zev doesn't think that hourly observations would have made a difference, because if Kelly had wanted to kill herself, she could have done it in the hour-long gaps between each check. My point is, sure, if Kelly has gone in with the express intention of killing herself, but if she knew she wouldn't be disturbed, how much more freedom did she have to amplify the dark thoughts? Did not being checked on disinhibit those thoughts? Did it encourage her mind to go in dark directions? A lot of what Zev has to say on this subject is compelling. But the fact remains that if nobody was checking on her in her last few days, which is standard practice in a mental health hospital, then whether it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, there wasn't the ghost of a chance on the morning of April the 7th that this could have been caught in time. This obviously is pure hindsight, but that meeting with her relief consultant on Thursday, April the 5th, turns out to be the hospital's last chance to save her. And nothing happens. As it is, of course, they have an incomplete picture, partly because they relied wholly on Kel to self-assess, but also because they didn't have the information about Kel's suicide threat on April the 4th. How does that happen? How do you call a hospital 7 times during office hours on both their main line and their emergency line, and nobody picks up? How the fuck does that happen? The answer came in an additional statement devoted solely to this question, written by the compliance manager at the Nightingale. On the afternoon of 4th of April 2018, the Nightingale's telephone lines suffered intermittent problems. Staff had reported that from time to time, calls to and from external lines falling out in a call, or were not connecting at all. The fault affected all of the hospital's extensions. The issue was eventually traced to the firmware of the hospital's firewall, which was updated to resolve the issue. The incident presented challenges to the hospital's resilience strategy. We learned two important lessons. Firstly, we assumed that when our telephone system was rebooted, our lines would be automatically redirected to mobile telephones held by management. This did not occur. Secondly, we underestimated how long the telephony suppliers would take to identify and rectify the fault. The Nightingale Hospital have now put in place an updated continuity plan, which would activate a more stringent reaction to telephone lines going down. Mobile phones have been purchased for the sole purpose of providing redirection cover in the event that landlines fail. The report also said that they were also going to put in a system that would allow for seamless resolution of line failures. Well, there you go. That's it, isn't it? They've identified the problem and they've fixed it. Of all the days to go down, it goes down on the afternoon of Wednesday, April the 4th. Of all the ways to take your life, how useful that she was somewhere that could let her easily have loose cabling and have doors that you could sling that cabling over to hang yourself. Of course, they fixed that too as a result of Kelly's death. Nobody can hang themselves from a door. All the cabling now charge their laptops at a nurse's station. They've sorted out their phones. Or just a few weeks too late, eh? I mean, it's in their interest to fix this stuff because 2 people on their wards have died now within 6 months, both of them treating the place like a hotel. If it happens again, they're fucked. I don't know. You hear them go through it. They're decent people. They're trying. Some of the procedures kind of shockingly exposed, really. The ligature thing with the cables and the doors. I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? Surely they would have worked that out before now. Which brings me to the last thing, which is 7:28. Hourly observations were suspended for Kel between the hours of 10 at night and 7 in the morning. But nobody comes to check on her until 7:28. That's not 7 o'clock, is it? What if she was just fucking around at 6:45 and a part of her was thinking that she'd be discovered? What about that for your 600 quid a night? When she recorded our interview, Kelly's friend Lisa spoke for pretty much all of us.
I've thought so many times she was in a hospital, maybe she just thought someone would find her and that it wouldn't. I've thought that so many times, and it's so hard to really understand it because there's so many things that contradict her. It didn't. I know she was in pain, but it took me such a long time before I accepted that this somehow wasn't an accident.
They were supposed to check on her at 7, and they don't come until 7:28. You know, what if she was doing something thinking maybe that they would come in?
You see, I would believe that, but then, you can't back out of a laptop call. Yes. You can't. And I believe, I really, really believe she did that deliberately. She did it so she could cop out. She meant business. Dark, twisted, sick little fucker. She meant business. She wasn't gonna pull the same stunt as last time. She wanted to be sure. She was gonna take, she wasn't gonna take some tablets and have her stomach pumped and some long ass story that would end up, embarrassing her all over again or whatever. No. Because I can't let go of the idea that she might have planned it. She was smart enough. She really was. She was smart enough. She might have known for a little while she was going to do it. And none of us would have been any wiser, really.
Now, Romina and I were having that conversation at the end of 2018. And this was before I had revisited Kel's emails to me from March the 8th, 2018, where I saw that she had been preparing herself for a suicide by hanging. This changes everything about how I understand those last 3 weeks. To what extent was Kelly in the back of her mind thinking about this? It reduces the chances of her suicide being impulsive and makes it seem more like what Kelly was doing was just grimly executing a plan. That's a huge outstanding question for anybody who loved Kel. An important part of that picture is working out the time that Kel died, because if she committed the act at 6:30 or 7 in the morning, that changes my understanding of what she was intending. So that morning, sometime after 7:30, paramedics took over from the nursing staff who'd been trying to resuscitate her, and rigor mortis had already set in. There are various but similar estimates as to how long it takes for rigor to become noticeable. The shortest estimate puts it at 3 hours. So that means that the latest she might possibly have taken her life would have been at 4:30 in the morning, but it could have been as early as midnight. Whatever Kelly intended, she hadn't expected to be disturbed. It was ultimately for that reason that the coroner ruled that Kelly had committed suicide. She delivered her verdict at the end of the second day of the inquest, around 4 p.m. on the 24th of January 2019. The coroner expressed sympathy with the hospital's position in treating Kel. She examined the decision of the consultant to take Kel off hourly overnight observations. The initial request had come from Kel, and it's because she didn't want to be disturbed during her sleep. The coroner noted that sleep is an important part of the therapeutic process, and given that Kel had been a voluntary patient, raised the question of, do you keep the therapeutic environment going by keeping the patient on board, or do you go against her wishes and say, sorry, you're on hourly observations? It was a decision that, in hindsight, the coroner said should have been taken in consultation with the hospital. But this had to be taken against the fact that Kel was a voluntary patient, perceived as low risk, was engaging with her therapy outside the hospital, and she also had a long-term therapeutic relationship with a consultant. The coroner described Kel as someone who was suffering from generalized anxiety disorder, ADHD, and possibly some form of personality disorder. Again, on the concerns that were raised by staff about Kel's lack of engagement with her treatment, the coroner summarized Kel's hospital routine. She'd stay in her room, sleep late, get up late, and not engage, just give yes or no answers. She'd go out for the day, to the gym, the therapist. She would go out at night and return late, causing a considerable amount of anxiety. She wouldn't answer her phone, and the unauthorized overnight leave. I can only imagine, she said, how worrying it was for nursing staff when she failed to return between the 29th of March and the 4th of April. But we have to remember she was an informal patient. What sanctions could be applied? Removal from the hospital? An environment that she said that she was benefiting from? For her consultant, said the coroner, this was a difficult path to tread. The coroner also noted that Kel presented very differently to different people in her last weeks. She said, the emails and contacts to friends portray a completely different side to that she portrayed to doctors and nurses. To them, she presented as someone who was at low risk of harm to self. It would undoubtedly have been of help to her relief consultant if he'd had the information about Kel voicing suicidal thoughts on the 4th of April. Would his risk assessment have been more fully informed? Would it have led to one-to-one observations? Highly unlikely, said the coroner, in light of the patient's presentation to the doctor on the 5th of April. And short of one-to-one observations, it's difficult to know how this incident might have been avoided. I formed the impression, she said, that nursing staff were doing their best in light of the limited information that Kel was providing about her real thoughts and concerns. She didn't volunteer her real thoughts, which puts doctors in a difficult position to appreciate any potential increase in the risk that she might have posed to herself. The coroner also pointed to the testimony of nurses and doctors, even her close personal friends and family, who, despite knowing that Kel was in struggle, all said that this was a totally unexpected death. In conclusion, there was no doubt that this was an act that Kel brought upon herself. We've heard that there was no note. We know that individuals with personality disorders can be impulsive, and we've heard that she said she had made attempts to prepare for strangulation by suicide. Then there was the contact about suicidal ideation on Wednesday, April the 4th. As well, the medics and the nurses on the scene testified that Kel had rigor mortis when they found her, so she'd been dead for some time. It wasn't a cry for help. So I have to ask myself, did she undertake an act with the intention of ending her life, knowing that such an act would end her life? And it is my view that she did. I shall record that Shaquelle Carla Iris Vidal died as a result of hanging. I shall say that on the 7th of April 2018 she was found hanging by a ligature attached to the bathroom door of her room at the Nightingale Hospital. She was a voluntary inpatient being treated for generalized anxiety disorder. There was no note of intention found at the scene. My conclusion is that this was a death by suicide. The coroner finished by thanking everybody for their work and their testimony, and then said, "But more importantly, I offer my deepest condolences to the family and friends on the tragic loss of this young, intelligent, and obviously much-loved young woman." The one outstanding thing that we haven't talked about yet was Kelly's laptop and phone. Months previously, Kelly's mother had spun all sorts of stories about these online, saying that I'd stolen them and that I was busy wiping them of evidence in order to conceal my wrongdoing, etc., etc. The truth, as usual, had nothing to do with anything that Kelly's mother was saying. The police, in fact, had been in possession of Kelly's laptop and phone all along, having removed them from her room on the morning of Saturday, April the 7th. The reason why is because Kelly's apparent suicide made this a crime scene, and it would have to be investigated. The police needed to scan the contents of that technology, and I suppose, in an ideal world, a suicide note would have been found which answered all of our questions about why she'd gone, and maybe there would have been instructions on what to do after she died. But at the inquest, police explained that they hadn't been able to crack the contents of Kelly's phone. This was because, as part of the standard security features of the phone, it was fitted with a special kind of lock which effectively would have taken police up to 28 years to crack. In context of all of the rest of the evidence that had emerged during their investigation, this was deemed by police to be disproportionate, and they didn't press on further. However, they had been able to go through her laptop, which also had her emails on there, and they'd found nothing suspicious, nothing that suggested anything unusual leading into Saturday, April the 7th. However, there was one thing that they found that I was very moved by. Kelly had apparently officially applied to have her surname changed to mine. So there was no will, no suicide note. She'd completed nothing of the admin that she'd written about on March the 8th. It wasn't a straightforward picture, but I think it's clear that Kelly didn't premeditate the time of her death very much in advance of it, i.e. she wasn't planning it throughout her stay at the Nightingale. In the couple of months leading up to this moment, yes, Kel had cultivated the idea of suicide. She'd even practiced hanging herself, and she'd developed elaborate theories and rationales as to why this was the right way for her. But quite importantly, that was wrapped up also in her sense that there was a proper way of doing this. She was going to get her affairs in order, sort out her finances, write a will. Her plan was to try and take control of this thing and do it with dignity and clarity. But she hadn't done any of that. In fact, almost everything that she'd done since March the 12th suggested that she wasn't in a suicidal frame of mind. The sharing of her depression on Facebook, her plans to change career and move house, getting those photos done by Tobiana in her flat, thinking about how to move forward in her life without James II. These were all things that she discussed with a lot of people, and she'd been questioned about it, and none of us had seen grounds to disbelieve it. You could see she was engaged with her future even by the book she had in hospital, a Teach Yourself Spanish book, a book about filmmaking that I'd bought her years ago. She was studying things, moving her mind forward. Of course, how committed Kelly was to sorting out her problems using the hospital's methods, well, that's another question. Because the whole time she's there, she's keeping them at bay. Another worrying thing had been her conversation with Romina on March the 23rd.
She tried to tell me a story of how they'd let someone commit suicide in some country near Scandinavia, maybe even in a Scandinavian country, whatever. Let her attempt suicide in the name of euthanasia because she had extreme post-traumatic stress disorder.
On that night out with Romina, she seems to have brought up all of the arguments that she'd used on March the 8th with me that had freaked me out. The ones about suicide as euthanasia, as a cure for PTSD.
And she's just saying this to me really, casually in a club. She means it. She genuinely feels like she's never gonna get over this. Like she's never gonna feel any differently. Because it was just the way she said it. Just so casually. But she just looked straight into my eyes. She said it with conviction.
What's really concerning about that is that March the 23rd comes at the height of her recovery, during the best period at the Nightingale. So regardless of how good her recovery was, those ideas, that dark rationale, was utterly available to her still in that period. But despite that, what I see is evidence of haphazardness, not a cold, ruthless, well-executed plan. Even though, for example, she'd had her big speech with Romina on March the 23rd, on the next day, the 24th, she's writing to Christina, inviting her to go cycling that summer in Europe. 2 days later, she's meeting Ollie to look at how she can revamp her CV, and she's still meeting with Tobiana, who she's planning to move in with. And she's committing to go to festivals, buying tickets for things throughout. So the urge had taken her either right at the very end or in those last few days. The thing that I'd found most haunting at the time of the inquest, and in fact I was quite fixated on it, were the hospital notes of Kel's last 3 days there. Nobody reports having long, engaged conversations with her after April the 4th, and those notes are almost the only record that we have of her at the end. I just couldn't shake that picture of her, slowly withdrawing, becoming less and less communicative, perhaps inside becoming more despondent and hopeless. It's like watching a car crash in slow motion that you can do nothing to stop. On Thursday the 5th, the morning after she's returned to hospital, she's woken up for the morning but goes back to sleep. She finally wakes up around midday. She doesn't engage with staff. She doesn't respond when spoken to. She refuses medication. No interaction with anyone, snappy when checked on. She refuses vital signs to be taken. On Friday the 6th of April, she stays in bed until late afternoon. The staff try and talk to her about her discharge plans, about her treatment. Does she want any food from the dining room? Because she's been in her room since Wednesday. Kel answers monosyllabically, with no eye contact. She says she's fine and she doesn't need anything. She continues to refuse her medication as well as having her vital signs checked. The last person to see Kelly alive is Nurse Judy Thomas, who conducts her last observation check on Kel at 10 o'clock that night. Kelly's observed lying on her bed on her laptop. Nurse Judy says hello. Kel looks up at her, but says nothing. During the inquest, the spectre of those missing days, 29th of March to 4th of April, had hung over the proceedings. I very much shared that concern. Had something happened before she returned to hospital to make her lose hope? I imagined that during this period away from hospital, there she was at home with gastroenteritis, coming off her medication, obsessing about James II, her mind becoming more desperate, culminating in her acting out with James and making this threat of suicide. Maybe something had happened in those days that had been the tipping point that had started the final decline.
On the 1st of April, we had more of a chat. She was commenting on something my mum's partner said on Facebook.
When I spoke with Kelly's friend
sent
Ollie, it was in March 2019. It was about 2 months after the inquest. And I'd put a request out before the inquest for Kelly's friends to share any details that they had in which Kelly, spoke about her depression or shared aspects of her care at the Nightingale. So a few people like Christina and Lisa had got back in touch with what they knew. But now, when I spoke with Ollie, it turned out that he had loads of texts and WhatsApps with Kel over the missing days. And he just hadn't shared them because he hadn't thought they revealed anything negative about Kelly's state of mind.
She sent me a screenshot of my mum's Facebook, yeah? I think she's got the comments up so you can't see the picture, but I think it's a picture of my dog in like a puddle of mud, right? And then my mum's commented on it saying he loved it, kept going in and out. And then my mum's partner says, as do all men, laughing emoji. And my mum replied saying you have to lower the tone. Kel sent me that, right? She goes, what the fuck? That's not even funny. He's doing bits with your mum, honestly. She's way better looking than him. He could at least try not to embarrass her on Facebook. She goes, Lamau, I could understand if he was some charming dude, but for fuck's sake. Oh man, this is why I say it was all jokes, man. It was all very much funny. So again, yeah, this is all like the 1st of April, right? That's like the week of.
It turns out that on the 2nd of April, Kel hadn't been ill at home, or maybe if she'd been at home, she certainly wasn't so ill she couldn't leave the house because she'd been planning to go on a Tinder date.
You know what? I was just talking to you about the date bit as well, and the lad and the football.
Yeah,
that was all on the 2nd. That was
on the 2nd of April.
Yeah, this is 4 messages. Kelly goes to me. He actually recommends a decent cocktail bar. He's having a laugh. He expected me to put on a full face of makeup and heels for a 60-minute date. Is he insane?
Who is this? Someone she met on Tinder?
I think so. What is that? Can I scroll up? I think this is telling you of the kind of guy she would go for, yeah? She sent me a screenshot where a guy... Shall I come over to you?
Yeah, come over, show me. Later, when Romina shared all of her WhatsApp correspondence with Kel, it turned out that Kelly had been writing to Romina about this as well. So on the soundtrack, Ollie's reading out his messages, but what you'll see are Kelly's interactions with Romina about this.
And this guy said, the match starts at 7:45. Right. And he goes, okay, no worries, I'll record and watch later. She goes, hey, no worries, I don't want to stop you from watching. He's like, you sure? If you're free Thursday, we can do something else. And this Brad, I think he's talking about a football game. Right. She goes, rah. So this dude wanted to move our date, our 8 o'clock date to 7 because he thought football started at fucking 8:45. He wanted to watch it. He wanted a 60 to 90 minute date match to then watch Premier League.
Max, right? Yeah.
Clearly not the man for me. What the fuck is that real life? And then she hit him with a message. I'm sorry, I've changed my mind. What was that I said here? My Prince Charming would have gone on a date and watched it on Sky Plus and kept his mouth shut. So the last I can find I spoke to her was the 4th of April. On the 3rd of April, I was sending her tickets to this festival, a link to buy them, and on the 4th she said, let's do it. And then she sent me like a fucking meme.
At what time on the 4th was that?
She replied to me at 2:35 p.m.
It's interesting that she was being completely normal with you on the 4th, because that was the day that James got in touch with me saying she threatened to take cyanide and she was off to do it. Elsewhere, there are endless texts between Kelly and Romina over the 6 missing days on pretty much every subject imaginable. And while Kel is characteristically dry and sarcastic about herself, she's definitely planning ahead. She'd also been in light spirits with Lisa.
I talked to her 2 days before she died. It was just a silly picture. Actually, the last meaningful conversation was the 2nd.
But when did she send you the silly picture?
On the night of the 5th.
On the night of the 5th. And what was the meme? Do you remember?
Oh, it was about tiny avocados. It's just a picture of tiny avocados, and she said, "Have you seen these anywhere?"
The final contact that I'm aware of anybody having with Kel is at 10:15 on the night of Friday the 6th of April. It's a text that she sends her friend Paige. It's about a trip that a bunch of Kelly's friends are going to go on, I think, to celebrate Paige's engagement. And Paige needs some money for a ticket. And at 10:15, Kelly drops a one-line message saying that she'll send the money in the morning. Those are the last words that we have from Kelly. So at 10:15, anywhere between 2 and 6 hours before she died, Kel was making plans. Kel didn't finally decide to kill herself until the moment before she did it. The scales tipped for her that morning. Why was that? Only now it was possible to ask why. Because now we knew the what. Now we knew what had happened. And so do you. If you've listened to parts 9 and 10, 12 and 13, and you've read all the supplements, you have the facts that were contested over, thought about, questioned. It took about 18 months from the time of Kelly's death to assemble the what. We'd had all the evidence that had been generated by the trial and the inquest, which took us to about 9-10 months after Kel died. And it took about 6 to 8 months to do the first assembly of this podcast, which also brought in all of this new evidence, all these interviews with Kel's friends and family and the audio of Kel. And just to be able to lay all of that out in a timeline, you build up a picture of what happened and the order in which it happened. And you would never have been able to work that out if you hadn't gone through this process. Because the picture of her that emerges is just bigger than any single strand that any of us had of her. And the picture is confusing. And sometimes it's contradictory. It was only by putting all of those strands together that we start to be able to ask the real question, which actually is the question that is on everybody's mind when they come to this case, whatever their point of view, which is why? Why did this happen? Kelly's behaviour at the Nightingale in her last few weeks raises questions. Indeed, so does her last year. Why had she become so medicalised? Why had her whole relationship to suicide shifted in the previous 3 months? She had a philosophy about it. Why? Why had she gone into hospital and not told the doctors that she was suicidal? Why did she decide to completely stop all her medication on the 29th of March? And why April the 7th? Why that morning? It's really foolish to theorize about what triggered Kelly to do it, what specifically she might have been thinking of. But when you listen to all of this evidence properly and look carefully at what Kel tells us about how she lives with her depression and her mental illness, I think it's actually possible to make a reasonable hypothesis about what her last few hours were like. And based on that, and of course all of the stuff that we've heard, I think it's possible to try and answer that basic question, which is, why did this happen? And why is Kelly gone? And so that will be the focus of the next part of this, which is also the last. This is a podcast for Kel.